So it is once again that time of year again where I sit down and film the mid-year book freakout tag and tell you all about the books that I've been loving so far this year, all of the books that have disappointed me, and some books that I'm looking forward to reading in the second half of the year. I love filming this tag every year. I think I've done it every year since I started BookTube. I feel like it's a BookTube staple that a lot of people do every year, and it's a really good way of keeping track of your reading throughout the year. Without further ado though, let's get into the questions, and question number one is, what is your favourite book that you've read so far this year? Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. I don't even know how much I've talked about this book on my channel. I would have mentioned it in a wrap-up a few months ago when I read it, but otherwise I don't think I've really talked about this book much, so it might be a surprise that it's my favourite book of the year so far, but I use something called Corpile to rate all of the books that I read. It was created by G at Book Roast. I always have a link to it in the description in case anyone's interested, but this has so far the highest Corpile rating for me so far this year, and I'm not really surprised because I haven't stopped thinking about this book since I read it. So this is dystopian fiction. It was written, or it was published in the 90s, but it's set in the 2020s. It actually opens in the year 2024, which was really surreal, and basically in this now alternative version of our present day, the world has fallen apart. It's set in the US and there's a very corrupt government. Water is now scarce because of global warming, and vigilantes roam the streets. So society has kind of collapsed. It's a bit like The Walking Dead or The Last of Us. If you've watched any of those types of TV shows, then you might get a sense of what I'm trying to explain. We follow a main character called Lauren who lives in a gated community, one of the few gated communities left in California, and she listens to the adults in her life talking about how we just need to get past this little blip and then things will go back to normal like they were in the 90s. But Lauren doesn't believe that. She thinks that they should be focusing on the future and how things might not get better, they might get worse. She also starts to form her own religion, which I found fascinating. This is really a story about survival. It's about how society has changed, and it's about how there are still some people who want to do better or they want to help other people. I should have mentioned actually, Lauren has something called hyper-empathy, so she can feel other people's emotions, which is obviously a difficult thing to cope with in this kind of world. It's very dark in places, so I would recommend checking content warnings if you need them, but I found the intensity so compelling, and I also went on to read the sequel, Parable of the Talents, and love that too. Octavia Butler, I think, has potential to be a favourite author of mine. In fact, I think I actually consider her a favourite author now because I've given everything that I've read from her 5 stars. The audiobook for this one as well was fantastic because it's written as a series of diary entries. I felt like I was listening to this main character tell me her story. Question number 2 is, what is the best sequel that you've read so far this year? Are we surprised that I'm choosing Assassin's Fate by Robin Hobb for the answer to this question? I devoured this 850-page book in less than a week because at this point in the series, I should have said actually, this is the last book in the Realm of the Outlands, which is an epic adult high fantasy series. There are 16 books I think in total, and by this point I felt so attached to the characters that I kept turning the page because I wanted to find out what was going to happen to them. This book in particular brings together everything that you've learned about the world and about the characters so far throughout this series, and it was just epic. It was a roller coaster of emotions. I cried so much, which I think I've actually just spoiled the answer to a later question, but yeah, this made me feel so many emotions, and I've actually been thinking about rereading the Farseer trilogy, which is the first trilogy within this series. I didn't love it that much the first time around, however I think if I were to read it now, having read the entire series, I would be viewing it more as a prequel, and I think I would just get more out of it. So I've been very tempted to go back and reread those books, but I think I might give it a little while because this destroyed me. Next question is a new release you haven't read yet but want to. Truly Madly Deeply by Alexandria Bellfleur I really want to get to because I loved the Written in the Stars series by Alexandria Bellfleur and also the Fiancé farce that I read last year. There's something about her writing that I just love, and the cover of this, I should say the US cover of this, is is so stunning. The UK cover is awful. I don't know why we keep getting such awful covers in the UK for Alexandria Bellfleur's books, but the US cover, there's something about it that I love. I think it's because the male character looks like that character from Stranger Things. I think his name is Steve. Let's be honest, that's the only reason that I want to read it, and also because I've enjoyed Alexandria Bellfleur's books in the past. Not in Love by Ali Hazelwood is another romance release that I haven't got round to yet, but I think this only came out a few weeks ago, so I'm gonna give myself a little bit of time, you know. Sometimes it takes me a while to build up to reading a book that I've been anticipating. I also still haven't read House of Flame and Shadow by Sarah J Maas, and at this point I don't know if I'm actually going to. I am much more excited to read Throne of Glass for the first time because I still haven't continued past the first book, so I think that's going to be my focus for this year, and then maybe I will eventually pick up House of Flame and Shadow, but I haven't heard the best things, and considering I didn't like the second book, House of Sky and Breath, it's just not a priority for me right now. Next question is, what is your most anticipated release for the second half of this year? I have two answers for this question. The first is A Witch's Guide to Magical Innkeeping by Sangu Mandana. This is the same author who wrote The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches, which was one of my favourite books of last year. It's not so much a romance, like it's about witches and there is a romance, but it's more about found family, and it was so heartwarming, so cute. I'm hoping that I get similar feelings from this next book by the same author. I'm also very much anticipating The Songbird and the Heart of Stone, I think it's called, by Carissa Broadbent, which is the next book in the Crowns of Nyaxia world. I read Serpent and the Wings of Night and the sequel towards the start of this year and loved them, fell in love with the world. I thought the world and the politics were really well developed, but the romance was also really strong and enhanced the story. It was my perfect balance of fantasy and romance, so I'm very excited to read more in this world. I know that this third book follows different characters from the first duology. I'm assuming that the characters from the first two books are still going to be present in this next book, but I am very excited for the character that the third book focuses on because they were one of my favourite characters from the first duology, and I'm very intrigued to see how their story develops. Next question is, what is your biggest disappointment of the year so far? The Teacher by Frida McFadden is the worst book that I've read so far this year. I know that's not the question, but I just wanted to mention that this book was awful. I gave it 1 star. It gave me the ick. I don't think it was very clear from the synopsis how much of a focus this was going to have on an inappropriate student-teacher relationship, and I can handle reading dark topics, but not in a book that's meant to be a fun, fast-paced thriller. It just, the tone didn't work for me and I hated it. Even though I'd read a few books by Frida McFadden before, I hadn't given any of them 5 stars, so I had kind of middle-of-the-road expectations. I wouldn't say that it was my biggest disappointment. My actual biggest disappointment of the year so far is An Education in Malice by S.T. Gibson. I loved A Dowry of Blood when I read it a few years ago, and I was so excited for this because it was marketed as dark academia, vampires, sapphic, so many buzzwords that should have worked for me, but this was so boring. The characters went from rivals to lovers too quickly, everything felt rushed, and yet nothing was happening. There was such a focus on this relationship. You don't even learn what the plot is going to be until around the halfway point, and the plot was rushed. It felt kind of pointless, and I think this would work for some people if you're looking for a romance first, but I need a bit of plot with my romance for me to feel fully invested. So yeah, I gave this 2 stars, which was such a step down from A Dowry of Blood, and now I'm really nervous to pick up Evocation, I think is S.T. Gibson's newest release. I have heard better things about that, so maybe I will give it a go, but yeah, Education in Malice was just so disappointing. I'm still upset about it because I was expecting it to be another 5 stars. Next question is, what is your biggest surprise of the year so far? The Devotion of Suspect X by Kigo Higashino. This is a crime novel that was a bestseller in Japan, and I've owned it for literal years and just wasn't prioritising it, but I finally picked it up back in January, and I think I gave it a 4 or a 4.5 stars at the time, but I've since rounded up to 5 stars. This is one of my favourite thrillers, I think, ever, because I can't stop thinking about it. It was so unexpected expected, and it was so unique because the book opens with you as the reader seeing a character get involved with a crime. Perspective then switches and you're following this detective who's investigating this crime. So you as the reader already kind of know what happened, and it's this cat and mouse type situation where you're watching the detective try and uncover what actually happened. It was just so unique, like the way that it was structured was so clever, and I did not see the ending come in. I should have, but I didn't. I think that's why it has stuck with me and why I keep recommending it to people. It's made me realise I really need to pick up more translated fiction, especially translated thrillers, and I also need to prioritise backlist thrillers because often they do end up surprising me. Next question is new favourite author, either debut or new to you. Carissa Broadbent, as I've already mentioned, I think has the potential to become a new favourite author. I would like to try her other series first though, before I confirm that, because sometimes I can fall in love with one series by an author, but then try their other stuff and it not really be my kind of thing. There is an author though that I've read more from this year, having read another of their series last year, and that is N.K. Jemisin. I read the Broken Earth trilogy last year and loved it, and then this year I read the Great Cities duology, starting with The City We Became, and I think there was just something special about reading this first book while I was in New York because it's set in New York, but there is something about N.K. Jemisin's writing that really works for me. She writes with this intensity that I love, and I love the way that her books are usually theme driven. There's usually a lot of social commentary, and that's the focus more than like the characters or the plot. I think her characters are still fascinating, especially the characters in this duology I thought were really interesting. For anyone who doesn't know, this series takes place in a world that is very similar to ours, except once cities reach a certain size, they come alive, and there are people walking the earth who embody these cities, and it was just such an interesting concept. I think if you don't care about New York, then you might not end up loving the series, but for me, it was perfect. Next question is newest favourite character. For this, I've gone with Vera Wong from Vera Wong's Unsolicited Advice for Murderers. That is a title that I always struggle to say, and I think I just got it right first time. But I read this book at a time where I really needed to read this kind of book. It follows Vera Wong, who is living in San Francisco, I believe, and she runs a tea shop. However, one morning she wakes up, goes downstairs to open her tea shop and finds a dead body in the middle of the shop. She doesn't trust the police to investigate properly, so she decides to take things into her own hands. And this isn't really so much a mystery, it's more a story of found family, and it was so heartwarming. I cried. I read this a few weeks after my nan passed away, and I think I just needed to read this kind of story that was comforting and warm and has the kind of characters that you really root for, and just the dynamic between Vera and the people that she meets along the way. She ends up bringing together a load of suspects that she suspects might be responsible for this dead body, and it was just so wonderfully written. I listened to the audiobook and I thought it was fantastic. 5 stars, would not be surprised if this is one of my favourite books of the year. Next question is a book that made you cry. I don't think I've read many books this year that have made me cry, which is really surprising because I have been an emotional mess for most of the first half of this year. I mean, I've already mentioned Assassin's Fate by Robin Hobb. This book made me sob. In fact, every single book in this trilogy, I think, made me cry. I think The Charm Offensive by Alison Cochrane also made me sob, which again wasn't expecting considering it's a contemporary romance, but I think just the way that the relationship developed was so heartwarming, and I tend to cry when I'm happy more than when I'm sad. Next question is a book that made you happy. I haven't read read that many happy books this year. Even the romances that I've been picking up have been more emotional and hard-hitting romances. But I did read, what's it called? Can't Spell Treason Without Tea by Rebecca Thorne a few months ago, and this was so cozy, so wholesome. It brought a huge smile to my face. It has a sapphic relationship, an established relationship as well, I should say, which I found really interesting. We follow these two main characters who decide to leave their stressful jobs to open a tea shop that's also a bookshop. You meet loads of different characters in this small town where they settle, which is on the edge of dragon country, and it was exactly what I wanted to read at the point that I read it. It's been compared to Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldry, which I would agree with. However, I think the stakes in this feel just a little bit higher. There's a bit more action. Next question is, what is the most beautiful book you've bought this year? I wasn't sure how to answer this question because I have been making a conscious effort this year to make sure that I'm reading more books from my TBR than I'm adding to my TBR. So there weren't many books I could actually choose from. And then I remembered I did order the Mime Order by Samantha Shannon from the Broken Binding to match my copy of The Bone Season. This is a series that I've already read. Well, I've read the first 3 books, so I don't count this as adding books to my TBR because I've already read them. I actually read them from the library, I think, the first time around, but this edition is stunning and it has beautiful stenciled edges. Really curious to reread the series because I know that the author has done a lot of revisions on it, especially the first book in the series, which I did think was the weakest. I thought this world was fascinating. It's set in like an alternative London where you're following these underground clans, like gangs of clairvoyants, because clairvoyancy is illegal in this world. The atmosphere is incredible. I love the characters and I'm very excited to at some point reread the series, well, reread the first 3 books and then finally continue the series. I think there's going to be 7 or 8 books in total, so I might just wait until it's completed now before I do that reread. The final question is, what books do you need to read before the end of the year? From the priority series list that I made at the start of this year, I only have 6 Crimson Cranes by Elizabeth Lim that I need to start, and also A Darker Shade of Magic by V. Schwab, but that's a reread and then I want to continue that series. There's so many series that I've heard really good things about and that are almost complete now that I would like to try, including The Final Strife by Sarah Al-Arifi. I think the final book in this series comes out later this year in a few months, and I've heard amazing things about it, so I really want to read this first book. I would also like to pick up Gideon the Ninth, maybe. I feel like this would be a really good book to read around Halloween or spooky season. The next book in the Dragon Scales trilogy also I think comes out this year. So Dragonfall is a really unique fantasy that I read last year. It's one of the few books that I got from the Goldsborough subscription that I absolutely loved. It doesn't have the best ratings on Goodreads, but I thought this was really interesting. It has a really interesting queer norm world and the characters I thought were well written, so I would love to continue the series when the sequel comes out. What else do I have on my shelves? I would like to pick up City of Last Chances by Adrian Tchaikovsky and also Silver Under Nightfall by Rin Chapeko. These are 2 books that I got through the Goldsborough subscription, and I think of the books that I still have to read from when I had that subscription, these are the 2 that I'm going to love the most. That does bring me to the end of this video though, so thank you for watching. If you made it this far, let me know in the comments some of your answers to some of these questions, especially what is your favourite book you've read so far this year and your biggest disappointment, because I feel like those are the juiciest questions. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you did enjoy it, and click subscribe if you would like to see more videos from me, but otherwise I will see you next time. Bye!